I remember I was forgotten on one of the days, and it wasn't funny. It was the worst mistake I made. As soon as I was starting to sleep, it would be time to wake up. I had nothing I could say. I kept quiet. You know, Baraf is a place where you submit. And 200 meters may not sound like much, but it actually can determine whether you will summit or not. So a number of people who've heard my story have been asking me if I'll return to Mount Kilimanjaro. Well, I've thought about it. If I'm to return to Mount Kilimanjaro, what would I do differently? If I'm returning, I would want to have a better experience than I did on my first attempt. I think the first thing I would do is to change the base camp. That is the camp from which you attempt the summit push. On my first visit to Mount Kilimanjaro, or my first expedition, I used Barafu camp as my base camp. Or rather, that was the base camp that was selected by my service provider. So we departed Barafu camp at 11:45 p.m. and I summited at 11 a.m. The first people in our group reached the summit at 9:15. So when you look at this, it is almost impossible to summit at sunrise if you attempt the summit push from Barafu camp. Once I was on Mount Kilimanjaro, I realized that not all service providers have the permit to take you to Kosovo camp. Kosovo is about 4,870 meters above sea level, while Barafu camp is 4,673 meters above sea level. So you find that there is a difference in elevation of about 200 meters. And 200 meters may not sound like much, but it actually can determine whether you will summit or not. So Kosovo is closer to the summit than Barafu. I later reflected on my journey and realized actually we had arrived at Barafu camp at 2 p.m. and we really didn't do much for about 6 hours or so when we went to sleep at around 8:30 p.m. And the honest truth is you may have to pay a bit more to a service provider who can take you to attempt the summit push from Kosovo. And when you consider how much time, how much preparation, and how much money you've already spent, it is actually better to pay a little more and summit Mount Kilimanjaro than to attempt the summit from Barafu camp and fail to summit. I remember the trek from Barafu to Kosovo camp took about 2 to 3 hours. When you're on Mount Kilimanjaro, the difference of 2 hours can make all the difference in whether you will summit or you will not summit. One of the things I didn't like about Barafu camp, it is a huge camp that stretches for kilometers, and yet it is overcrowded because this is where all groups from all routes converge. So you'll find that this is the only camp on Mount Kilimanjaro that has both ascending and descending groups. So the congestion doesn't really help it when you realize that Barafu is already a very hostile camp without water, with so many other hardships. When I look back, I reflect on our day 3 journey when we reached Lava Camp at 4,600 meters above sea level. Lava Camp is almost at the same height as Barafu Camp at 4,673 meters above sea level. So you find that in terms of elevation acclimatization, you may not gain much at Barafu Camp over Lava Camp. And actually, the people who got altitude sickness at Lava Camp actually were not able to proceed. So it means if you are able to proceed beyond Lava Camp on day 3, you could actually be able to manage the elevation of Barafu Camp and a little higher. So another challenge that we encountered on the summit night was the elevation, that is altitude sickness as we went higher. You find that Kosovo, at a slightly higher elevation of an extra 200 meters above sea level, provides better acclimatization to prepare you for the summit push. So the next change I would make if I was to return to Mount Kilimanjaro is to have only one proper meal at base camp and sleep more. I remember we had lunch about 4 p.m. and dinner at about 7 p.m. This led to interrupted sleep. So this means we were starting the summit push already tired. You actually need to sleep properly and deeply to be able to trek to the summit. Because remember, this is the most challenging day of your expedition to Mount Kilimanjaro. And actually, the reason you went to Mount Kilimanjaro is to summit. As an older person, starting to sleep maybe at around 5, and then being woken up again for supper at 7, then going to sleep again at 8:30, and then you're woken up again at about 11 p.m. It meant actually, as soon as I was starting to sleep, it would be time to wake up. So I actually just started the summit push already tired. So the change I would make is to ensure that I have one proper meal, and I mean proper, and sleep more until about midnight. And remember, my target is to sleep at Kosovo. So if I wake up at midnight at Kosovo, I have a better chance to summit. I really think the worst mistake, or one of the worst mistakes we made, is to start the summit push when we were tired and sleepy. The third change I would make, and the most important change I would make, is to go in a small group. Having gone to Mount Kenya a year before Mount Kilimanjaro in a small group, I saw the difference. On Mount Kenya, we were just 2 hikers, a facilitator who was also a friend, a guide, a chef, 5 porters. So our team was a small team of about 10 people. On Mount Kilimanjaro, we were 29 hikers, about 10 guides, 60 porters. That's roughly about 100 people. Going in a big group was the worst mistake I made in my hiking expedition to Mount Kilimanjaro. I'll talk a little more about this. Okay, on Mount Kenya, as a small group facilitated by Aruka Health, I can say we got personalized attention. Secondly, we were consulted and engaged in every decision that was made. For example, we actively participated in making the timetable, even in making the menu, especially at the time I went to Mount Kenya. I was pre-diabetic at that time. So this was very important that I eat the right food in order to summit. When you eat the wrong food, it can determine whether you will summit or not. However, the most important decision we made on Mount Kenya as a small group was to spend a second night at the base camp, that is Shiptons. We had left Shiptons at 2:30 a.m., summited at 9:30 a.m., and arrived back in camp about 2:30 p.m. We were clearly too tired to trek 14 kilometers to a lower camp. There was also the danger of meeting wild animals because there are wild animals on Mount Kenya, including elephants. Such a decision would have been difficult to make if we had been a larger group. You'll find that most groups that go to Mount Kenya actually have only dinner and breakfast at base camp. And then after summit, they quickly descend to a lower camp. However, because our group was small, it was possible to reorganize the logistics, and we now had more meals at base camp and were able to have lunch at the lower camp just before exiting the park the next day. After my experience on Mount Kenya, having received very high quality service from Aruka Health, I had very high expectations of service. Anyway, in summary, let me say that there are challenges of hiking Mount Kilimanjaro in a large group. For example, being a group of almost 100 people, coordination was difficult. For example, remember, the hikers we had segregated into slow, intermediate, and fast hikers. meaning we arrived at camp at different times. For example, on day 4, the scheduled time of arrival was 2 p.m. The first hikers arrived at 1 p.m. My group, which was the intermediate group, arrived at 3 p.m. and the last hiker arrived at 6 p.m. Surely, this makes it very difficult even for the kitchen staff to serve meals on time. Coordination of other services was also difficult with a large group. For example, in the morning, bathing or wash water is brought to the tents by porters and guides. Some tents would be forgotten because we were so many. And sometimes, by the time you realize you have been forgotten and go looking for the water, 30 minutes or 45 minutes have passed, and sometimes even 1 hour. This would lead to late departures from the camp, meaning it would lead to a late arrival at the next camp. I remember I was forgotten on one of the days, and it wasn't funny going out looking for water when everybody is already at breakfast. Another challenge of a large group is that it's difficult for the kitchen staff to keep track of the dietary requirements of different hikers. This makes it very challenging for both the hikers and the kitchen staff. One of the things I really didn't like much was that the porters would be the last people to eat, yet they work the hardest. I remember there was one night, the last night on the mountain, the porters ate their dinner at midnight. Is this dinner or breakfast? So if I was to return to Mount Kilimanjaro, the fourth thing I would do differently is on the side of medical preparation. And please hear me well. If you are diabetic or pre-diabetic, carry your own glucose monitoring machine. It's called a glucometer. Make sure you carry your glucose testing meter. Having been promised that this would be one of the tests available, I was very comfortable. At base camp, I felt ill. When I requested the paramedical person to test my blood sugar, to protect the identity, I will say they told me I didn't need the test as I didn't look sick. Surely, I have lived in this body since diagnosis with this condition for like 4 years. So when I feel ill, I know how the body feels. I had nothing I could say. I kept quiet. You know, Baraf is a place where you submit. And if you've watched my other videos, you know I returned home with raging blood sugar. Now I know better. I would carry my glucometer or glucose meter if I return to Kilimanjaro. And even for you viewer who is listening or watching, if you go to Kilimanjaro, carry all your medical gadgets and all your medicines. Don't rely on a service provider promising to take care of you. If you've ever climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, please share in the comments section the advice you'd give to somebody who is planning to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. We'll see you in the next video.